to the Q&A box. Once you do that, please also put your name and the affiliation as well. My colleague Wenjie Ying will help me compile these questions, and we'll be looking at the questions at the end of the discussion. Okay, so we will first of all start with a quick introduction of the panelists. And once I introduce everyone, I want to ask each of you to give one quick anecdote about yourself that may not be in your resume. And I'll give a little example by myself. So I'm Yumiko Ono, and I've been traveling, living in different places around the world all my life. So my life story is Tokyo, New York, Tokyo, London, New York, Tokyo, New York, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and soon I will be moving to Singapore. So that's my life in a nutshell. Okay, I'll start by introducing Harika Mandana. She's the Southeast Asia Bureau Chief for the Wall Street Journal based in Singapore. And Harika was previously a correspondent in Hong Kong, writing about a range of issues, including sanctions against North Korea and disputes in the South China Sea. So Harika, please give us your anecdote.
Thanks, Yumiko. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I had a pretty non-traditional path into journalism. I started off as a lawyer and studied many long years to be a lawyer, graduated as a lawyer, had a number of offers to start a career in the law. And then I decided, hey, who needs to make all that money as a corporate lawyer? I'm going to change direction and become a journalist, much to the horror of all the sane people around me. But it worked out well. I do miss occasionally not being able to speak in unending sentences, and discovering the full stop in writing has been a bit jarring, but otherwise all good.
Thank you, Harika. Okay, we'll move on to Eric Bellman, based in Delhi, and he's leading the South Asia team at the Wall Street Journal, where he has worked for more than 20 years. And most of the time with the journal for Eric has been in India, but he was also based in Indonesia and the Philippines. So Eric, please give us your anecdote.
Well, it made me think. I was thinking about the IIMs. I went to a grad school, Johns Hopkins. Not smart enough to go to IIMs, but back in those days, I graduated before starting a journey traveling all around the world, just like Yumiko, and I was looking for work. And back after I finished graduate school at Johns Hopkins, I was looking for work. And back in those days, you used to have to mail your resume and things and ask for jobs or internships or meetings, anything. You'd have to do it. Email was around, but nobody was using it that much. And the other day, because we're moving office, I ran into all of my rejection notices from those times. There's the Seattle Times, the Economist, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, Gannett, Los Angeles Times. It keeps going. And then I gave up on journalism, Financial Times. I gave up on journalism, tried the World Bank, even the White House rejected me at this point. Interestingly, the Wall Street Journal also rejected me then. And I had to do 5 years in a less exciting job at Bloomberg, but it ended up being really a learning experience, and it worked out quite well. So I just wanted to put that out there in terms of you guys that are looking for work, get out there and be glad you don't have to write letters.
That's right. There's hope. There's hope eventually. Thank you, Eric. So from IIMK, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Debesh Chatterjee, a second-time director at IIMK, and he has taught leadership classes at Harvard University and various IIM campuses. He's a two-time Fulbright Scholar, has trained more than 15,000 managers, and has written 18 books. Professor Chatterjee, please introduce yourself.
Well, I must first thank the Wall Street Journal for being part of this wonderful event. For me, COVID-19 is a catastrophe of misrepresentation and misperception, where not only the future is uncertain, but as somebody would say, even the past is uncertain. And so my meeting with Mother Teresa in Calcutta could be the best anecdote that I can think of right now. I was inviting an American business professor called Mike Norton, and he wanted to meet Mother Teresa. And this was Calcutta of the 1990s. I just got into that IIM, the first IIM of India in Calcutta, a city of potholes, power cuts, and poverty, where you drive not on right, right or left, but on whatever is left. And I asked, what is your leadership mantra? And Mother Teresa said, small work with great love. Couldn't understand what she meant. So I asked her for clarification, and she said, work that is bound by time and space is limited in time and space, but love expands beyond time-space boundaries. If you do small work with great love, your work is likely to grow. I still wasn't very sure what she meant. And I was coming down the staircase in Mother House in Calcutta with Mike Norton, having forgotten my briefcase in the euphoria of meeting India's Nobel laureate. And here I see a 70-year-old woman coming down a flight of staircase with a pacemaker in her heart, wanting to return that briefcase to me. It is then that I understood what small work was and what great love was all about. That had been for a long time my recipe for leadership: small work with great love. That's my anecdote.
Thank you, Professor, for your anecdote. That is very touching. Thank you. So Professor Rudra Senzarma, he teaches economics at IIMK and has held positions like Dean. He has also worked for the Reserve Bank of India, has published more than 40 papers in international peer-reviewed journals, and is an expert on microeconomics, financial systems, and economic development. Professor Senzarma, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Yumiko, and good evening, everyone. So as part of my introduction, I'll share a very unlikely reason behind why I chose economics as a career. So back in school, I was a big fan of science fiction, and I used to read the great Isaac Asimov and his Foundation trilogy, in which he describes a very interesting discipline called psychohistory, which is of course a fictitious discipline, but he describes it as something that uses data from the past to predict future behavior of societies using mathematics and statistics. So that kind of fascinated me, and later on I figured out that economics comes closest to what Asimov described as psychohistory. That's not the only reason, of course, why I chose economics, but one of the reasons. And here I am analyzing data and trying to understand human behavior.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so now we'd like to dive into the topics. We have a lot of ground to cover. It's been more than a year now since COVID swept through the world and disrupted the global economy and completely changed the way we live and work. Now let's take stock of where we are right now, and we want to start with the Indian economy. So Eric, the Indian economy was one of the hardest hit by COVID, and it was supposed to make a roaring comeback, but now there's a big surge in infections. And you just had a story out last night about the latest. So give us an update on what you're seeing now.
I think I've covered lots of ups and downs in India since 1999, and this one's been hard to read. In particular, just the unusual circumstances, but I think more than other rebounds and downturns, there's been this K-shape. There's been people at the bottom of the economy are getting harder hit than the people at the top. People like myself that get to work, like I can stay at home and work online, I've been able to keep my job, and it hasn't been that awful for me. People that have to be out there working and don't make that much and don't have that much savings, they've been hit harder. Now we've seen that on the rebound as well. The top line GDP numbers look like they're going to roar back, maybe 10, maybe 12% was the prediction not long ago. But if you look below the surface, below the listed companies, below the organized sector, you see a lot of suffering still going on. And that's where most Indians live. So the question is, how do you create a rebound that includes more people and incorporates more people? And that's the biggest story we're going to be covering this year.
Thank you. Professor Senzarma, so if you really take a look at the Indian economy and the impact that COVID has had, how many years do you think has COVID really set back India's economy in terms of economic goals or job creation, things like that?
When people usually talk about the economy being set behind, they refer to GDP. And going by GDP, of course, one can easily say that COVID has set us behind by 2 or 3 years. But the bigger concern is that of GDP per capita, which reflects the average person's share in the whole pie. So I'm afraid that's where we really need to focus on. And I agree with Eric, that inequality which was already widening, not just in India, but the world over, has now got worse because of the COVID pandemic. And I think we need to look at inclusive growth. We need to build social safety nets so that the top line growth gets trickled down to every part of the population, and we should be able to get back on track in another 5 years as far as GDP per capita is concerned, but perhaps 2 years as far as GDP is concerned.
5 years as far as GDP per capita, that's a long time. What do you think is the roadmap to that? Or, I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about what that 5 years is going to look like? Because that sounds like such a long time.
Yes, so I think the government of India provided massive fiscal stimulus last year, along with the RBI's liquidity support to the economy. So that helped. Of course, we are still going to end up with a small negative growth this year. But I think what is needed going forward is continuing fiscal support. To paraphrase Richard Nixon, we are all Keynesians now. So the fiscal support has to continue in spite of rising debt levels. Along with that, the government has to reform the economy. It has already taken some measures, but those will take time to show results. So the government is trying to reform the agriculture sector. The government has promised to bring in labor reforms, which will make it easier to hire and retrench workers. The government is trying to incentivize foreign investments, but much more reforms are needed. For example, privatization of public sector companies, making it easier to do business in India. So these are some of the continuing structural reforms, which along with the fiscal and monetary support will see us through this recovery.
And, you talk about the stimulus, and we'll talk about the US and the stimulus and what that's happening a little bit later on. But Eric, I want to go back to you and talk about the tight lockdown that India has had, and then the easing, and then the lockdown again as the surge happens. I mean, what happens to an economy when you have such a strict lockdown? What have you seen in your reporting?
Well, definitely last year when there was a lot more uncertainty about what this virus was, there was India rightly so took a hard line because we did not know. We did not know then whether it would be 2% or 20% of people that would die from this thing, and said, let's just stop for a second. Everybody stop in place and let's see what's happening. And India did stop. If you look at the Google mobility numbers, they went down to 90% below normal levels. People just stuck in their houses. And during that quarter, they basically stuck with the lockdown. Now, the economy took a big hit because of that. When nobody's moving, the economy contracted more than 20%. And that was probably the worst in the world for a major economy. This time, the question is, first, that also leads to the dead cat bounce or the base effect, where we're going to have a bigger bounce after that. But it also, I think this time, we are seeing less of concern because people know what they're dealing with. So if you look at Google Mobility Report, it hasn't gone down as much. People are taking their chances. They're making educated guesses about what they can get away with. Now, the rules kind of change with changing viruses, but you see, despite the surge that's bigger than we saw in September last year, the Google mobility numbers are still not as low as they went in September. Definitely not as low as they went during the lockdown. So that Google mobility figures, those are economic, that's economic movement. That's people buying stuff, that's people delivering stuff. So what we're hoping for is this time, it's going to expose more people, but they're taking a calculated risk that they've got to go out and earn money and get the economy going. And you won't see as deep a dive this time. And you may just see sort of some of the froth wiped off of that rebound. That's what we're hoping for. And I think it really has to do with that uncertainty. People think they know this time that, okay, my family's been through it, my cousin's been through it, my neighbor's been through it. This isn't as scary as we thought last year. I'm not, I was scared too. I went to Australia. We did not know how bad it would be. Now we have an idea what we're dealing with. People are going to make calculated risks and they're going to expose themselves. On top of that, you add the vaccinations and you've got the most vulnerable people are getting, like myself, are getting vaccinated. That's going to give people even more confidence. So I think we're not going to see a return to that level. Having said all that, it's still, there's a redefining of the way that India's economy and India's companies and India's households are going to work. And that's going to hurt the people on the bottom of the pyramid. And we've got to figure out a way to help them because it will rebound, but they're not going to be asked back to their jobs. So what's going to happen then? That's my concern about the future.
Sure. And you know, this whole COVID.
Sorry about the K-shaped recovery, and just to broaden the canvas a bit, and to make the point that the K-shaped recovery is a global phenomenon. We're seeing it on the global stage between developed and developing countries, and then within individual countries between different categories of people. So I cover Southeast Asia, which has been not as hard hit by the virus as some other parts of the world, but very hard hit economically because of dependence on sectors like travel and tourism, remittances, the services economy, all of these pillars of the Southeast Asian story that collapsed almost overnight last year and haven't rebounded. And the kind of outlook is bleak, partially because of vaccine access. And I think that's a really important piece of this for many parts of the world, that over the last few months, as we've seen the US do millions and millions and other parts of the world do millions and millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of doses, some countries have vaccinated less than 1 million people in Southeast Asia. And the timelines that you're looking at for 50% populations to be vaccinated, or herd immunity levels of populations to be vaccinated, we're talking between 3 to 5 years just to get that level of inoculation. And so if you linked that to economic recovery, you're starting to see why the picture is bleak and why the recovery period is prolonged.
Yeah. And all the different rollout periods for the vaccine per nation, even the developed nations, is going to have a big effect on the global economy going forward. Now, Niharika, I want to get back to you and talk a little bit about the story you did last year, because I put that on the reading list for people attending the seminar today. In Bangladesh and Myanmar, the garment workers and what happened to them. Can you talk a little bit about that story and what you found there?
That was a really difficult story to report on. This is one industry that in many parts of South and Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, also Myanmar, Vietnam, many other countries in the region relied on it to employ people who don't have education, who don't have a lot of advanced skills, but are able to, with minimal training, get a job in the formal sector, start moving from rural to urban areas, and make a living. It's sort of seen as the first step in this ladder towards progressing to a formal economy, to more stable livelihoods. And what you saw with the collapse in retail in the West, when people stopped going, couldn't go for a long time to shop, and then didn't have enough disposable income later on to spend on things like an additional jacket or a new pair of jeans, etc., that the orders started falling for those products, and garment factories were struggling. In the beginning, you had a situation where orders were sort of halfway through. So you had, half-stitched jeans, and you got a call from your client, saying, "I'm sorry, we can't take this." Or you had a shipment en route between Bangladesh and Europe, and you would get a call from a brand saying, "Look, things are dire, and we're going to go ahead and cancel this." And so this was a huge hit for factories. Factories decided at that time to do some layoffs. Some of them decided to do reduced hours, but then it went on and on and on. So in the beginning, people thought, okay, if we tide over this for 3 months, surely the next season, the winter season, the knits will come back or something will come back. And it didn't, and it continued and it continued and it continues to extend now into a second year, where in Bangladesh now, of course, there's again concern about a surge in cases, there's concern about lockdowns and access and travel to factories. So this is an industry that, since we're talking about K-shapes, this is an industry that really, in terms of employment, supported the lowest rung and is continuing to bleed and suffer.
I mean, that was a great story, and it's, just shows how fast things are happening and how disruptive it is for people, especially on the lower rungs of the K. So now I want to turn to Professor Chatterjee and take a look at the Indian economic policy, how it's been performing so far. So it must be so, it's difficult for any country, but India has especially had it rough with the economy shrinking so much, recession so much, and then going up and then going down again. How do you think India has done so far in handling COVID?
I would make a reference to COVID-19 not just as a pandemic, but as an inflection point. We may call it a parenthesis in history because we haven't seen something quite like this before. Metaphor for relative impermanence of all our economic, social, and geopolitical models. At the cost of sounding like a Buddhist, let me tell you that this is really true, because I can see that this is only a milestone for many of the disruptive forces which we have now just about begun to anticipate. You're looking at climate change. And so the so-called certainties of those models, based on certain projections on data that are also dubious, is going to risk something that may not be based on reality. The beauty of having a grasp of reality is that your projections tend to match what might happen going forward. But if there is no sense of reality, and I can tell you that given the amount of obfuscation of information that's happening, and rightly so, you cannot expect a politician to give all the data that's coming out of his constituency. For me to predict what might happen, see what happened in SARS 2004 to a 2008 meltdown. This is one of unestimable dimension, because we haven't seen quite something like this in the last 40, 50 years. And so if you look at the leaders in business, and you come to just a little reflection on the world of business, redistribution of disrupted supply chains, connecting with a remote workforce. For instance, Pepsi has started giving cushioned office chairs in Bangalore, and retain essential employees. TCS and Infosys announced hefty salary hikes 1 year back, and they are wondering what to do now, right? And then breaking bad news to employees. Times of India is closing down printing units, retrenching editors, as well as maintain their own energy. I've heard a CEO who says, I do exercise 3 times a day to maintain my personal energy, given the kind of pressures on me. So if you're talking about reality beyond those models, I think those models have to be revisited in relationship to what is real. And the grasp of that is the most critical thing before everything else. I can get a bunch of economics to talk about the economic scenario, but their predictions will be based on data. As I said, just as the future is uncertain, the past is equally uncertain. What data am I basing these predictions on? Maybe Rudra can give you more clarity, but I see from the perspective of leadership, which I'm going to speak on later, I think it goes way beyond economic models, because we're talking about a very complex society where there are multiple economies at work. In a city like Mumbai, there are 8 different economies at work. And so which economy are you talking about? That would be my question. Rudra, if you want to add something to it in a line or two.
Yeah, so following from what Professor Chatterjee said about data and information, you see, India was criticized for one of the harshest lockdowns last year when the pandemic started, but the government was also constrained by the lack of information about what is this that had hit the country. And you could argue that they panicked, but I think they took the abundance of caution and locked down the economy, because there were dire forecasts that there would be millions dying on the streets. So that was a decision that they took in the absence of data or information, whether from the WHO or from medical experts. Later on, of course, as information started coming in, the economy was slowly opened up. So I think, this was a great sort of experience of decision making at every level, whether it's politicians or economists or bureaucrats or business people in decision making with lack of complete information.
Yeah, that's what was happening to all the countries, the lack of information. Now, I want to go back a little bit to Niharika. You mentioned the vaccines and the rollout, and Eric, you've been to visit the Serum Institute, the biggest vaccine manufacturing facility, and I want to talk a little bit about India's potentials or challenges to becoming a vaccine manufacturing hub. Eric, can you talk about your visit there and what struck you about it?
Well, first, I think the whole world is sort of discovering these people, the Poonawallas in particular, where they've been well known here for a long time, particularly in Mumbai, where I used to live. I would see the senior Poonawalla roaming around in his Rolls Royces at the racetrack back in the day. In fact, I even tried to ask him for an interview once. He ignored me, rejection. But it's literally within our company, it's been difficult for me to sell this story. And I'm like saying, no, you don't understand. India makes all the vaccines. India, the Serum Institute is the Toyota of vaccines. This is what they do. They do more than 1 billion doses a year. So it's taken a while. And I had to keep pitching the story, and you don't understand. This is for real. They've got the biggest facilities.
I didn't know until recently either. Yeah.
So I went to visit, and I've talked to other Poonawalla and others a number of times, and spent times following their vaccines in their delivery. And they really did sort of take a big bet, partly because they aren't listed. They could spend millions, tens of millions, he would say hundreds of millions of dollars ahead of time before it was even approved, and start transferring his capacity over to this AstraZeneca vaccine, which he was very optimistic about. He ended up being correct. It was a big bet. Bill Gates and others helped back him a little bit on it, but he was able to do this early and huge in a way no one else can, because he has the equipment. Everybody else was waiting for approvals to be close. Then they order equipment, then they set it up, then they train the people to use it. They already had it ready to go. So they are churning out soon 100 million doses a month. And that has ended up being a problem, because they're stuck in the middle of politicians now that have noticed them. In India, they're like, why are we exporting? When they were exporting earlier, they were saying, why are we exporting so much when we need it locally? Internationally, they said, you only got the right to produce this vaccine because you promised to export it. Where are our vaccines? So they're in a tough place right now, but I think they're such a powerhouse, and they just have such capabilities that people aren't going to be just sort of fed up with them and go somewhere else. They're going to continue to raise India's profile. They're going to do it with more. I saw the Novavax facility being put together. They're going to do it with other Indian companies are going to come up and do it as well. There's also significant other companies, including biotech. And so India is making its name right now. And I think sort of like the outsourcing industry, when people figured out that Indian companies could do very sophisticated things, it brings more customers. And I think the same thing could happen with this great vaccine drive. Again, it's getting weird and political for the next few months as capacity comes up. But if they come out of this ahead, and Delhi doesn't nationalize them, and the international community doesn't blacklist them, it's going to be a great success story. And people are going to say, if you can do something as sophisticated as these vaccines in India, what else can we do there? And I think that's a good thing for making India. It's a good thing for India.
So it's like a new spotlight on a different part of India that may not have had the spotlight before. But at the moment, the spotlight, there's a bit of a challenge, because it cannot do what it promised to do, which is become the world's manufacturing hub.
It's been the world's manufacturing hub. The people that depended on it knew this, but the West did not know that. Now they're saying, where are our vaccines? And so it's getting a little weird and political. I think in the end, they can grow their way out of it, and it's going to be great for India, domestically and internationally.
Okay, so one of the people who did talk about India and vaccines was U.S. President Biden. And I want to talk, Niharika, if you could take us through the reason why India is in the spotlight with the US right now. And, you know, President Biden and Prime Minister Modi have talked on the phone already. Why or how is India important to the US?
So many ways. So let me start with what we know about the Biden administration's foreign policy. And one of the key things that we've learned, it's still early days, obviously, but what we know about their approach so far is putting alliances and partnerships at the center of the foreign policy. And this was quite clear in the choreography of the early diplomatic meetings that the Biden administration organized in the Indo-Pacific. You saw the big sort of Quad summit that happened last month, where you had the leaders of Australia, Japan, India, and the United States virtually, of course, talk to each other, the first such summit. And then you had Biden administration officials travel to the Indo-Pacific, meet with various senior officials in Japan, South Korea, and India. And then you have that kind of made-for-TV meeting in Alaska between Chinese officials and US officials. And that choreography or that chronology was not by accident. The idea was to convey in part to China, but also to the broader world, that alliances and partnerships were going to be an important component and a way to differentiate, if you will, from the Trump administration's policies in the Indo-Pacific. On India specifically, you know, if you look at just the trajectory of the Quad, which is quite telling, I've covered the Quad for many years, and even a few years ago, when leaders of the Quad or officials from the Quad wouldn't even meet in that grouping because of what it was seen as, or because of concerns of how Beijing would see it, to the point now where there is, you know, good level of significant engagement on substantive issues. I think it's a journey that is quite remarkable in the space of a few years, and a few things have changed in that period, both in India and the United States. On the Indian front, obviously, over the last 2 years, because of the situation on the border, particularly, the mood has changed significantly towards China. There is a lot more skepticism about China's intentions, a lot more wariness about the prospects of a unipolar Asia, and having China so close to India is a concern there. Historically, India was hesitant to be seen as too close to the United States for a number of reasons, including the US's policy in Pakistan, which was seen as problematic in New Delhi, weapons sales and things like that. We've kind of, you know, transcended all of those chapters of uncertainty and hesitation to a point now where India is comfortable saying we're friends, and we want to talk about defense pacts, and we want to talk about military intelligence, and we want to talk about these very serious ways of interacting with each other without worrying about other things. For the United States, India is just geographically, in terms of being present in the region, in the Indian Ocean, a really important anchor to have a partnership here close to China. If you're looking at it through China's lens, the fact that India is a democracy is a really important part of it as a force. You may have noticed that the world is not so big on democracy these days. And so to have democratic friends in the region and be able to rely on them is a really important part of US policy. And then India's economic story as it plays out will also be an important part of how the US positions itself. Not to forget, finally, what we're seeing emerge in terms of partnerships. So working with India, Japan, Australia, or you know, working with some arrangement of these countries on various issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's military deterrence, whether it's vaccines, any of these topics that you pick, India is an important part of it, and India is able to work with other US partners in the region. So India has a great relationship with Japan and is able to work in trilateral and bilateral settings. India is working with the United States the Raisina dialogue is happening, and you're seeing a lot of other sort of configurations come up. There's an Australia, France, India sort of grouping that's emerging. So there's a lot of interesting activity in terms of various countries coming together to up capabilities. And I think the US supports a lot of those things. So India is extremely important. And this is a relationship that has bipartisan support in the US. So whether you ask the Republicans or you ask the Democrats, this is it's a no-brainer.
So India is really.
Can I add something to that, Yumiko? So, so far Biden's policies on the international front to me seems like a continuation of Trump's policies sans the rhetoric. To give you an example, Biden has made it very clear that the tariffs that were imposed on China are not going to be reversed very soon. He is focusing on economic recovery in the US, so that's the priority right now. The Biden administration is putting American interest first. To give you a small example, linking with the Indian vaccine and pharma industry. So one of the challenges that the Indian pharma and vaccine manufacturers are facing is the lack of critical raw material, which the US has put a ban on in exporting to India. So the way the government is trying to overcome that is try to set up manufacturing capability in critical inputs and raw materials within India, because as we said earlier, as we move away from globalization to probably regionalization, it's going to be increasingly important to take care of your own interest. And what it means for India is that no matter what Biden does, whether it changes Trump's policies or approaches or not, India has to make itself more competitive in order to be able to benefit from whatever new world order emerges from this.
Harika, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, I think I would say, the trade picture is quite a bit complicated, and perhaps we'll get to that in a later segment. I think for the Biden administration on issues of trade, there are some circles to square between international expectations. If you look at what happened with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the US's withdrawal during the Trump era from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it continues to be cited, not in India, of course, which has its own misgivings about big free trade agreements, but in Southeast Asia, for instance, or other parts of the region, Japan, South Korea, others, the TPP continues to be cited as a sign of US retreat. And there is a desire or an expectation that the Biden administration's policy on trade issues as it pertains to the rest of the world will have to be laid out at some point as to whether the US is going to engage on rule setting, whether the US is going to engage on questions of IP and climate, whether the US is still interested in multilateral agreements. I think there is a lot of obviously hesitation even in the Biden administration on those issues, because if you look at the domestic scenario in the US, there is not a lot of support for these kinds of deals. And it would be very hard for a Biden administration, even if they were inclined, which I don't think they are, but even if they were inclined, it would be really hard for them to get, for instance, to sign back on to the TPP, which now is, not to bore everyone with an alphabet soup of acronyms, but the TPP is now the CPTPP, which is TPP minus the United States. And some countries like Japan have been talking about perhaps the Biden administration bringing the US back into the CPTPP. The CPTPP does not include China. It was, the TPP was negotiated by the Obama administration. But on the domestic front, there is really little support in the US for deals of this sort. And within the Biden administration, I think there is a lot of skepticism. If you listen to the things that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has said, even before he took this position, he and others, I think, believe that these kind of tariff-reducing mega deals shouldn't exist anymore, that they don't help American workers, that they don't help American factories. And all of them have said that American workers, American factories should be at the center of US foreign policy. So how you balance, or how you look at these competing sort of priorities between signaling to export-oriented countries in Asia about your willingness to engage on these issues, be present and be a leader, while balancing domestic priorities at home, is one of the subjects that the Biden administration is going to continue to grapple with. And we don't yet have a clear enough idea, I don't think, as to how they're going to do it or what kinds of deals we're going to see emerge.
So it's going to be really tough for the multilateral agreements. It's not clear what's going to happen. And India is not in CPTPP either, is it? So that's another sign of how challenging it's going to be. Okay, we're going to move on to another topic, just stepping back a little bit into leadership in the COVID times and post-COVID times. And Professor Chatterjee, I want to ask you about leaders that you've seen who have reacted particularly well. And in your book, Karma Sutras, you mentioned New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern and how you were impressed by what she did. Can you tell us a little more about what you were talking about?
Well, see, the kind of leadership that we are likely to see is going to be balancing tensions between polarities. I can see three polarities very clearly. One is the polarity of clutter versus clarity, social distancing versus compassionate engagement, between survival of business and openness to new growth challenges. If you look at the tensions that are visible in the enterprises, in commercial enterprises, if you look at a country size problem, if you look at New Zealand and India, for instance, I make a mention of Jacinda Ardern's handling of COVID because she has handled this tension so remarkably well. See, the typical trade-off that most political leaders have had was the trade-off between safety and commerce. Now they would say that if you close down, if you lock down, and if there is no business, people will die. This may be true if you don't understand that this is a false dichotomy, because if you are not safe, where is the commerce available? So she took the kind of bold decisions that was very difficult for a politician to take. And mind you, she comes back with a rating that New Zealand hasn't seen for the last 100 years. Almost 92% of New Zealand responded by saying that they support her as a leader, and they have not seen anything quite like this. So there is this dichotomy between rigor and relevance in research, as we say, is also a false dichotomy, because rigor is a new form of relevance. This is a woman who comes from a typical academic background. She does take stock of the situation and bases a decision based on data and on facts, and something that is so remarkable. And you cannot compare this particular Prime Minister with anything that we've seen in the world so far, because this is for the first time I'm seeing the kind of boldness of politics. If you look at what she did in terms of gun laws after Christchurch massacre, you know, the way she went about her business of figuring out that this is no way to kind of run a country. And to take those kind of hard decisions going forward would take not just political will, not just charisma, but something much more, a sharp intellect. So the trade-off between compassion and competence is again a false trade-off. You can be compassionate, you can be competent at the same time. I think we haven't seen a leader quite like that. That's the reason for my talking about her in my book, and unfortunately.
I think you also, is there any particular kind of leadership skill that you have come to either see as a need, or have actually seen leaders develop? Is it speed? Is it retooling on the run? Is it doing something that goes against what you would think would help you, or anything like that?
See, the thing I think is the most, if you were to ask me if there was one thing that leaders needed the most today, it would be clarity. And very often clarity is not about having more data. Clarity is actually the exact opposite of that. Having greater awareness and to be able to hold data to its logical conclusion. I think clarity comes much more from awareness than it comes from thought structures. Unfortunately, one of the gifts of the COVID-19 was the removal of unreality in the form of the loss of election by Donald Trump. I think that made for a lot of, I'm sorry to say that, but that made for a lot of reality in the space of politics, because we're living in an unreal world. Now, if you come and look at Zoom coming from nowhere and taking over, in fact, overtaking American Airlines in market capitalization, just the other day Zoom was born. It is unthinkable, right? Now, if you had clarity, this would not be such an unthinkable proposition. If you look at, for instance, 15% of CEO time ought to be devoted towards developing clarity. If you cannot imagine Pfizer developing a vaccine in 1 year, that would take typically 10 years for an organization that trying to develop in any time, then you would know that, the CEO of Pfizer must have gone through a lot of reflection before you come to a conclusion that this is possible. It can't just be a sort of, high testosterone decision. It has to be thought through. And if I'm thinking of an institution like ours, we have a vision called 2047. Trust me, it was not developed as a result of COVID. We said, if we can look backwards from the future, you get a lot of clarity about what you should not be doing going forward, right? And you see, as a school, we hit upon this idea of 2047 because that's a great inflection point for India. Political India became independent in 1947. Economic India became independent in 1991. And educational India became independent in 2020 with our new education policy. Now, if you look at 2047, you realize a country that's grappling with so much of complexity already has the wherewithals and the clarity to go forward in its own way. So the democracy that we're talking about in India is very different from the democratic traditions that exist in many parts of the Western world. For instance, New Zealand and India can't be compared because New Zealand is just 500,000 people in Auckland capital. Delhi is 30 million. It's like 5 million people as opposed to 1.3 million people. So if you look at clarity as to how India has to solve a problem, it has to come from not just a deep-seated understanding of models that are present, economic, social, and other things, but also in terms of a large-scale awareness and intuitive grasp, so to speak, of the large picture. Without that, you will not get clarity. So if you get caught in the throes of solving COVID-related problems, as a CEO is ought to be doing, he doesn't have that precious reflection time. And I think one of the greatest gifts that you can give to a leader today is time to reflect, as to reimagine the future, very unlike the past.
I could imagine that could be so tough when things are moving so quickly, but it sounds like what you're saying is that clarity is really the important leadership skill that you need, especially at a time like this. Thank you, Professor. So we would like to now move on to, wow, there are a lot of questions that have come in, and I may not be able to get to all of them, but I want to go all the way back to the Indian economy, and there's a question from Rohit to Professor Senzarma. I think you'll be the best person to answer this. Are we looking at hyperinflation in the coming years, the way things are going?
Yeah, that is always a concern, that when you are pump priming the economy, and that's not just in India, but in most parts of the world, inflation is bound to catch up when you are close to full employment levels or have crossed that. So there are some factors, of course, that give some relief, which is probably oil prices may not be as high in the future as they are today, as the world moves towards cleaner technologies and alternative energies and battery operated cars. So if energy prices are subdued, if central banks continue to use their tools to keep inflation under control, if monsoons in the Indian context are going to be good, as indeed the forecast for this year is that we'll have a normal monsoon, which means bountiful harvest in the agriculture sector, then hopefully inflation will not go out of hand. But right now the priority is growth over inflation. We'll have to worry about inflation eventually.
Okay. And there's another question for you from Jithin. What are the different impacts on different sectors as the recovery, maybe the global economic recovery takes off? Are there some sectors that are going to do particularly well and some that are not going to do well at all?
Yeah, I think this is a little related to what Professor Chatterjee was saying in terms of leadership abilities during the crisis. So from an economic point of view, what I see is that those businesses who were successfully able to combine innovation and technology and agility are the ones who did better. So for instance, clothing or apparel firms who quickly started manufacturing masks, chemical companies who started manufacturing sanitizers, FMCG companies who started home deliveries or went into e-commerce. So these are the ones who turned out to be the winners. So I think that's also a lesson going forward, that there is no substitute for being innovative, using technology, and trying to spot opportunity even in adversity.
Okay, so those are the industries that you think might do particularly well. Okay, I have a question for Niharika from Charles. So, which one is the best for India in terms of economic proposition? Is it the CPTPP, RCEP, or what? Maybe you can very quickly explain what they stand for first. I'll leave that part to you as well.
Oh gosh, how long do you have? So there's essentially two agreements. One started off as the TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was negotiated during the Obama administration. The Trump administration pulled out of it. The countries that remained in that pact continued without the Americans, and they renamed the pact the CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that's one agreement that does not include China, but includes a lot of other nations, including the US, the TPP, but not the CPTPP. The RCEP, the RCEP is an agreement that was led by Southeast Asian countries that does include China, that included in its many years of negotiations, India. And then India pulled out of RCEP last year and did not sign RCEP.
So India's not in CPTPP or RCEP.
Correct. Neither India nor the United States are in either of the two big trade agreements. This is a really divisive issue. After India pulled out of RCEP, there was no dearth of commentary on both sides. Some people slamming the government as protectionist and talking about how India was, instead of focusing on trying to become competitive, was trying to throw up the walls and kind of that school of thought. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are people who say those kinds of deals are not good for a country like India, did not have enough protections. You had Minister Jaishankar, who's the foreign minister, argue that a lot of FTAs that India had been a part of had maybe hurt domestic manufacturing without really helping exports grow. So I think there is a lot of debate and there are very strong opinions on both sides. And I think India has, RCEP has left the door open to India to re-enter should India change its mind in the future or figure out provisions on certain issues that it would be more comfortable with reassurances on, so that it is reassured that the market is not flooded with certain kinds of products from certain countries, etc. But it doesn't look like that's something India would be interested in, because nothing will have changed in terms of the big kind of aspects of the deal.
So the question was, which will be better for India? But it sounds like India may not want to be in either.
I don't think India would want to be in either, but maybe Professor Senzarma has some opinions.
Professor Senzarma, do you have any views on this?
Yeah, so I think that, for India, there is the economics part and there's also the politics or diplomacy part, which is, the discomfort of entering into a free trade agreement with China, where China is present. So perhaps India might push for bilateral agreements with the US or the UK, or probably with South America or African countries, or maybe try to strengthen South Asian cooperation, and or probably try and engage with ASEAN. So those are the options that I see India has.
Okay. Okay, so bilateral agreements may be more the way to go. Okay. There is a question on leadership for Professor Chatterjee. From George, what are the cues that business leaders should look for as opportunities in this time of disaster? What are the cues?
Well, I would say look for potential for engagement. I think there's a deep linkage between engaging people and productivity. I don't think leaders are doing that enough. I can tell you, why would Jacinda Ardern take a pay cut? Why would Azim Premji not take the parking slot meant for chairman and say the first person who comes to office will have the chairman's parking slot? Because it is fundamentally the opportunity to engage the customer, the consumer, in co-creating the businesses that are going downhill. Because I think potential exists. There will be sunrise industries, there will be sunset industries. If you look at the hotel sector, you'll be surprised to know that the extreme luxury segment seem to be doing okay. But also the budget hotels are doing much better than the 5 stars. Why is that so? Because if you can engage the market based on how the market has morphed since the COVID, because it's not the same market that you're looking at. You're not looking at the same power of purchasing power. You're not looking at the same reality any longer. So can you re-engage your constituency? Can you re-engage your customers? Can you re-engage your followers in a way that is different? If you look at our Prime Minister's engagement, you're talking about 30 different languages. You're talking about states with different political and socio-economic conditions. So if you cannot engage all of these in their own terms, just giving a blanket speech to entire India, like entire New Zealanders who would receive a speech from Ardern, will not work in India. So will the electorate be re-engaged very differently for you to win the next election? Because economy is going to hit the electorate possibilities very hard. So if you ask me, how do you scout for opportunities? Just as I said, clarity was one word for decision making. Engagement is another word for scouting for opportunities. You have to re-engage the market at a different price performance point. Try different methods of selling that same product. I mean, that's all I have to say for the time being.
So clarity and engagement are the 2 key words to take away from this. Thank you, Professor. So we're running out of time, and I was not able to get to everybody's questions. Apologies for that. But I wanted to close off there. There's a lot going on, and we will just have to keep watching and perhaps reading the Wall Street Journal to find out more about what's going to happen to the Indian economy and the world. I wanted to thank the panelists once again for your insights, for a very lively discussion that we had. Thank you also to the audience for attending the event.